Hey folks, welcome to WordPress Security. This is a YouTube live event, which will allow me to share my slides with you via YouTube. Hopefully you're all on here and viewing that properly. I do want to mention that I can't hear you, so if there are comments or issues that you have, you're going to need to, sorry, one sec. You're going to need to submit them via our Q&A document. And if you look down in the bottom section of your screen, you'll find some text there that says, please copy and paste the following link in a new window. That's going to take you to our Q&A page where you can submit questions. Brian DeConick is here to help us as well. He's going to be answering some of the questions if he can, or alerting me if there are things that I need to address for you. But he's around if you need help, because again, I'll mostly be presenting and I won't necessarily be able to hear things that you're saying. Can you guys see? Yeah, okay, good. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get going. It is worth mentioning too, yes, there is a slight delay with YouTube Live between when I am displaying the slides and the things that I'm saying. So I may be a little bit ahead of you, but we'll try to keep working on it. Hopefully I'll address all of your questions and we'll get through this just fine. Okay. What we're going to talk about today for WordPress security, a little bit about why it's important, and specifically the potential vulnerabilities with WordPress that make it not secure and how we can address those things. We're going to also talk about how you can defend yourself and your WordPress site. Some of these will be sort of basic end user things that you can do, up to more complex things that should be managed. Quite likely they're things that are managed by your system staff and things that you don't necessarily do yourself, but that you can be aware of in terms of there are things that can be done to help protect you. And then we'll take some time to talk about what happens if your site does get compromised, how you can try to address that. This is good advice for any WordPress site. So this can be a campus site at NC State or your own personal site off campus. We're happy to share this with anybody because WordPress security is good for all of us. So to be clear, this presentation is not hands-on. This is obviously something where I'm just doing the presentation and speaking to you directly. And again, we'll be doing a Q&A so you can ask questions, but we're not going to be demoing WordPress and configuration for security in this presentation. It's not going to make you a WordPress security expert, and it's certainly not a guarantee that your site will never be compromised. But we do hope that this gives you awareness of the things that you should be paying attention to. The terminology, one of the things that you might hear is that WordPress sites need to be hardened against attacks, and this is what we're going to attempt to help you do. This will ideally mitigate your risk of your site being hacked and make yourself less of a target. So just real quickly, I'm going to make sure there are no questions over here. Looks like we're good to go. So let's rock and roll. Is WordPress secure? Yes, and also no. Of course, it's never that simple. This is a question that we like to ask people, but we know that it's a complex answer. Out of the box, probably it's not really secure, but it is fine if you're just doing a very basic site. The more complexities you add, the more plugins you add, the more complex your theme, and depending on the source of that theme, it opens you up to more and more vulnerabilities the more stuff you install, and the more you extend WordPress. So yes, out of the box, WordPress core is fine. And WordPress in general, when it's kept up to date and hosted in a well-managed environment, should be okay. But there are other things that you may need to be doing beyond that. So this is a basic WordPress. This is like the default theme from a few years ago. There's nothing else in here. It's just sort of your basic content and basic users. But it is not secure when WordPress when themes and plugins and new users are added and things begin to be customized more and more. And then it starts to get a little dicey. Now, one of the big questions that we get a lot is, why is my WordPress site being hacked? There's a lot of questions about why you would be a target. You may be someone who runs a small site that doesn't have that much content in it, or is like for a small department or a small grant, and you're wondering why in the world would somebody be trying to hack my site. Number one, because you use WordPress, which is heavily utilized. Because there are so many people using WordPress, it's not that there's lots of people out there who can practice hacking WordPress sites, which sounds bad, but is true. Because WordPress is so open, it's open source and available, and anyone can build a site or build a theme or a plugin, there's a lot of potential vulnerabilities out there, and that makes WordPress more of a target as well. Typically, what we see for content management systems, and those are environments that allow you to add content, dynamically, and then apply themes and plugins to it. WordPress, Joomla, Drupal are common ones, and WordPress is far and away both the most popular and the one that's most infected or most often hacked. The other reason that you're a target, and you may not be aware of this, is because you run, most of you, a .edu website. Potentially you don't, but even so, a lot of times SEO gives you a big boost. Google will prioritize edu domains over others. And a lot of times other security groups and the like will also be a little slower to blacklist an edu address. As that bullet mentions, it's often an entry point to other valuable systems or sources of information. In the past, EDUs haven't always done a great job of protecting user information, like social security numbers or other things like that. There's not always great human resources or IT staff for managing it. So there's a lot of reasons why an EDU site might be appealing to a hacker, both in terms of its profile and on Google and for other users, and then also for the kinds of information that may be in it. So unfortunately, EDUs do get hit pretty often. Excuse me. There's a lot of different ways that your site may be hacked or reasons why it may be hacked. Some of the examples of what occurs during a hack are things like a backdoor is applied, so files are added to your site to reinfect or retain access. And this one's really tricky. Pretty much any attack that happens out there is going to have some kind of backdoor, whether it does other things like spamming or doing malware or anything. Most of the time, the first thing a hacker is going to do is put in a backdoor so that they can try to get access to your site even after you try to clean it up, or that they can reinfect you again later. Other parts of the attack, things like malware, which is just malicious code that will try to attack your site in various ways. Spamming and SEO related attacks are ones that try to use a website's higher search engine optimization, is what SEO stands for. So try to use the website's position in the search engine results to display their content instead of yours. Exploits or DDoS attacks are used to attack other sites, so they might use your site to launch attacks on other sites. Some tools, some hacks will attempt to use your site to send mail or abuse other server resources that might be available to your site. On NC State's campus, we do limit to some extent how much your environment can take use of your server resources, but you can still send mail and stuff like that via WordPress, so that's an issue. Some hacks are just good old-fashioned defacements, which just mean they will take over the website, the homepage, make it unusable or promote unrelated content. You may see the more popular quote-unquote Rickrolling, where people use Rick Astley's "Never Gonna Give You Up" to make fun, basically just amuse people and show that they can hack a site and that they did. And then finally, for phishing, so attempts to legitimize an external source or another source by posting links on your site and trying to trick users into sharing sensitive information. So these are different types of hacking intents and the types of things that you might see showing up on your site. So in terms of when you see these, as I mentioned, backdoor is usually the number one thing that a hacker is going to do, in part because whatever else they want to do, they want to be able to try to get back into your site again. It's a real issue where you might think that you have cleaned up your site completely, but if you haven't done a thorough enough job, that backdoor might still be there and your site can be hacked again. And it's a real problem for trying to address that. In some cases, you might even be hacked earlier than you think you are. Sometimes you'll be hacked and then the hacker won't immediately do anything with your site, because most of the time you're looking for the really sort of significant, obnoxious changes to your site, but you may not realize that a backdoor was put in and then it sort of laid low for a while and then they came in and did a further attack later. So that means you actually have to go back farther than you think to restore the original unattacked site that doesn't have a backdoor. It can be difficult. Malware is very popular. Spamming and SEOing, people use that a good deal. So you can sort of see the types of other things people use, but backdoor is certainly the most popular. One of our friends from higher ed in WordPress is Paul Gilzo. He does a lot of great stuff for security. And one of his statements is, as an owner and maintainer of a WordPress site, it is your responsibility to be paranoid. And it might sound a little, paranoid, but it's very true that without having that mindset, you're more likely to be attacked, or at least to not be prepared if you are attacked. So some of the potential vulnerabilities in WordPress that you want to make sure you're aware of. When a hack occurs, about 40% of the time, that's because of some kind of hosting vulnerability. And we'll talk more about what that means. The idea there, or the important thing to mention there, is that's not necessarily something that you as a site owner can be responsible for. It's your hosting company, but it is important to realize what those numbers are. About 29% of the time, it is a theme vulnerability. So something's written into the theme that caused a problem. About 22%, it's a WordPress plugin vulnerability. And obviously, the older your plugin is, the more likely it is that you may have those kinds of vulnerabilities. So keeping things up to date is critical. And then 8% of the time, it's because of a weak user password, which is to say that it's a good old-fashioned hack where somebody guesses at an ID and a password and gets in. And we'll talk some more about that too. The WordPress plugins, over time, this has gotten better, but there were a few plugins for a long time that were really the source of a lot of the hacks that were out there. So Tim Thumb is one of them. This almost doesn't get used anymore. It was a little piece of code that helped with images and image resizing, and it got used in a lot of different plugins. And so when the vulnerability was identified in that, that got used repeatedly for a number of sites that were using different types of plugins that had that piece of code in it. So that was a real problem, and it's taken a while to sort of get that code out of all the plugins that were using it. Another big heavy hitter was Rev Slider, which is a image slider rotation graphics tool. So generally, we pretty much stay away from that. And then another one is Gravity Forms. And I think Gravity Forms has been doing a better job. In part, it's a little bit tricky just because they collect so much information. And so there's so many opportunities for getting content into the site, including there are options for uploads and things like that. So a number of vulnerabilities through that type of content are much more significant. So again, the vulnerabilities related to WordPress itself, either because of the theme or plugin or WordPress core, is about 50% of the time. And this is mainly when things are out of date. And honestly, this is the number one thing that you should absolutely be doing. This is step 0 to security for your environment. If you're not keeping your stuff up to date, you're just making it easy for a hacker to get a hold of your site. Anything that's poorly written or maliciously written, even, because you can have themes and plugins built by anyone. And if you haven't done your due diligence in vetting those, you might be putting something out there that's either very old or was not written securely, or was even written with damaging intent. So you always want to be considering both the popularity and the maintenance, the ongoing maintenance of the stuff that you're installing. Hosting vulnerabilities, as we said, are about 40% of the time, and that includes things like SQL injections, if your hosting company hasn't done quality server security, or if they aren't really clear on how WordPress works and what the potential vulnerabilities are. Certainly, there are more things that your hosting company can do to secure a WordPress server than what they would maybe do depending on anything else that was hosted on that server. So you can check and make sure that you have most recent versions of PHP and MySQL available. Your server, your hosting company should certainly be doing things like malware scanning and some other mod security, other types of security tools. Wherever possible, trying to have individual accounts isolated as much as possible so someone can't hack one account and then get onto another account with unrelated installations of WordPress. And again, understanding how WordPress works, which a lot, certainly here at State, we work with our system staff a great deal. So they're very much aware of the kinds of issues that WordPress has. That's not always the case for other off-campus hosting companies, but it's certainly a perk when you can find that. Some examples of the other 8% of issues. These are user vulnerabilities. And these are also things that are really simple and should certainly be addressed for any user, both in WordPress and in other tools. You really want to make sure that you don't have bad habits, that you're not writing down your password and leaving it, attached to your monitor, or, worse yet, carrying it around with you, right? You want to make sure that you have strong passwords, that at a minimum that you have some sort of default password requirement on your site and that you're meeting that. Some of the more common problems that we see, by default, a lot of people tend to create their first account in WordPress with the username admin. It's quick and easy to use. It's generic. It's easy to share out with people. Maybe that's just the first account you create, and then you go back later after you have things set up and create accounts, that are more tailored to you, and that's the one you use normally. But if you don't delete that admin username, that is completely the most common username out there, and a hacker probably 90% of the time will start trying to hack your site by using the username admin. So you definitely want to make sure that that is not a username that you use. And going further, it's better if you can use more abstract usernames that aren't easily guessable, like first initial and last name, or something else really generic like that. You can have spaces and dashes, and you can even make a username and email address. So in as much as it's something that you can remember, it's a good idea to have a strong username. Poor passwords are also a problem. Please don't use something like 12345 or other really obvious ones. And then also making sure that your user access levels are set appropriately. So if you have a user who does not need to be an administrator, if they're just editing content, make them an editor. If someone hacks their site as an administrator, they can do a whole lot more damage than they can if they're just an editor. Now, one caveat to all this, I do want to mention, is just that on campus, most of the sites, certainly the sites that OIT Design hosts, we use campus authentication for logging in. And that's important to mention because what that does is it ties your login to your Unity account and password. While that may mean that the username is a little bit easier to figure out because it's sort of public, right? It's available. That also means that we have certain requirements in place. We have stronger password requirements built into your Unity password. We have stronger requirements built in for how often your password is reset. We have stronger requirements, for your account, and making sure that that's used is a better idea than just creating a generic account for a single WordPress instance. That way, if you change your password ideally every couple months or at least once a year, and you're not going to forget it, so you know that it can be a really strong password. It's not a password that you have to write down on a piece of paper. So this is why we use Shibboleth and Campus Authentication for most of our WordPress sites. And whenever it's possible for you to do that, it's a good idea. Okay, so other ideas about how to defend your website. First, pick a good hosting company. This is critical. Make sure that if you're off campus, that you are picking something that's solid and that has experience with WordPress. In some instances, it's totally possible to not pay for a whole hosting environment, and you can just host a WordPress site specifically. And if that's possible, that's nice. Again, you're welcome to contact OIT Design. We work with campus hosting as well to address those kinds of issues. You want to make sure that you're evaluating the themes and plugins that you're using very carefully. You certainly want to make sure that you're looking for themes and plugins that are hosted out of WordPress. So if you go to wordpress.org, there's a repository of plugins, and you can review those. And within that repository, all the plugins should have basic information like the last time it was updated. There's a review system. There's an opportunity in that environment to submit requests or report problems or bugs, and then have the plugin developers respond. So that environment is really set up for making sure that the themes and plugins that are in there are solidly built and reputable and being reviewed regularly and that kind of thing. It's also a good idea to make sure that you only install what you need. So when in doubt, have fewer plugins. If there's something that you don't need anymore, or if you're changing from one type of plugin to another, maybe you're choosing a different form plugin than you were using in the past, then be done with the old form plugin. Go ahead and transfer all the forms that you need to the new tool and then uninstall the old plugin. Don't leave it hanging out. And then be thoughtful again about which users should have admin level access, or how many users should have admin level access. Really, ideally, there shouldn't be any site that needs more than 4 or 5 admins. That should really be the max. You want to make sure that you're doing backups. There are a number of tools that can help with this, and you can also often back up your entire hosting environment. So however your site is built, you want to be thinking about making sure that the themes and plugins that you're using, your files, your database are all backed up. Ideally, you're not backing them up into the same environment where the rest of your stuff is hosted, because obviously then, if you get hacked, there's a potential that the hacker has access to all your backups as well. So you're better off if you can export your backups to Google Drive or Dropbox or to Amazon Web Services or something else for storing that for the longer term. And you want to make sure that you're saving your backups for a while, at least 6 to 12 months of backups. Again, as I mentioned before, a lot of times a hacker might try to hack your site and compromise it, but then not immediately do some damage. And so it's possible that you may need to restore farther back than you even think that you do. Updates, very easy to do. And there's so rarely do you do an update and it breaks your site. But most WordPress sites are out of date. Not most, but many. There are a lot of WordPress sites that are not kept up to date regularly, and this would solve a huge number of problems. So the number one thing that you should be doing, updating your site and your WordPress core and your themes and plugins. Now, WordPress can be set to do this automatically. After WordPress version 3.7, and we're at 4.9 now, there was code added to configure your site to be updated automatically. And what that's going to do is allow you to update, allow you to set your site to be updated automatically in the case of various updates. So here's a little bit of code that you could add to wp-config to update core and or your plugin and themes as well. Most of the time, again, this does not cause problems. So this is a good idea. Maybe you don't want to do it to themes and plugins. That's understandable, but core is a good idea. Specifically, it's worth mentioning that these updates are generally applied to just your dot updates. So for example, 3.7.1, 0.2, 0.3 are your dot updates. So it's not going to do updates to your major changes. So for example, 3.7 to 3.8 is a more significant update, and that would still require you to go in and manually make that change. However, you can choose at what level that occurs. So if you want, you can force it to update for any major updates, including the dot updates if you wanted to. And there's more information at the codex URL that's included there. It's a great idea to make sure that you maintain and review your environments every 6 to 12 months. So at least once a year, put it on your calendar now. Go back and look around and see if you have themes and plugins that are not in use or something that hasn't been updated recently. Check the plugins that are in there and make sure that they're not more than a year or two old. If you're in a multi-site environment, if there are sites that are no longer active or are not being used and you can safely get rid of them, that's a good idea to do. If there's users who have left the university or who are no longer needed, or at a minimum, if you can reduce their permissions from admins or editors down to subscribers or contributors, that's a good idea. And then just confirm that your backups are working and that whatever security plugins you're using, which we'll talk more about those later, that those are configured correctly and that they're working properly. So some of the tools that you should be aware of from a server perspective, and again, for a lot of us that do simple maintenance of a site, this may be well over your head, but in general, you want to make sure that your system staff is taking care of their hosting environment, that they have malware scanners set up, and mod security, which is a tool for putting in restrictions in your environment. htaccess is something that some of you may have heard of. This is um, a file at the core of your site that helps control how WordPress works and how your site functions. And so you want to make sure that being able to edit that is extremely limited. That should only be something that you can do, or that it's not open to different tools to have that access. With that in mind, file permissions for other things. So making sure that the appropriate permissions are set for being able to edit the different directories in WordPress. Again, we talked about in terms of hosting, having accounts separated into different environments so that if one site gets hacked, it doesn't necessarily affect multiple sites. It's a good idea to know where your server logs are, and if you need help with this, you can reach out to your hosting account, or your hosting, either campus hosting or your off-campus hosting. Most environments will have server logs and just some sort of text file that you can review if you need to. And it's great to always have good communication and a working relationship as much as you can with your hosting group or with the group that's helping to support you, just so that you're staying in touch with them and aware of what's going on. If there are other issues, campus in particular, there's always updates. In the last couple of years, we've rolled out https, so added SSL certs for campus. And updated to new versions of PHP, and the server updates have been taking place over the past couple months. So there's always things that are going to be ongoing, and if you're paying attention, you should be getting emails from your hosting group about that kind of stuff. And if you have questions, reach out to them. htaccess, I talked about briefly. There's a lot that can be done with this. So again, it's important that you limit access to this file. But among other things, you can restrict the access to your environment by restricting IPs. So the web address that people are coming from. You can also set this up to hide file directory listings. So for example, if somebody goes, by default, if somebody goes to a directory and there's nothing, or a URL, a landing directory, and there's nothing in there, it may list the files that are in there or other folders that you can then navigate with, and you should really try to hide that. You want to make sure that you can prevent the execution of PHP scripts, which might potentially allow a hacker to do more damage. And then just generally only have in there what is necessary and expected. WordPress has certain things that they need to go in the htaccess file to work properly. If you are on campus and you're using campus authentication, there are some things that need to go in there. But in general, if it doesn't need to be in there, then don't put it in there. So here are some examples of some code that you might see in htaccess. Some of these are things like restricting the types of files that show up in here. The rewrite engine is to help point to the correct URL if you need to adjust the URL of your site. I'm going to skip over some of this. The other big file that you need to be aware of if you're not already is wp-config. And so wp-config.php lives in the root of your WordPress installation, and it includes a lot of information, including your MySQL connection, your database user, things like that. In this file, there's options for either activating or disactivating PHP, error reporting, and file editing. This is also where you can change the ability to either automatically update, like I talked about before, your themes and plugins, or even turn off the ability to install new ones. You can remove the ability for people to comment on your site universally with adding some code to wp-config. So it's very powerful. There's other code that you can add in wp-config to sort of quote unquote harden your installation of WordPress and restrict access to it. So it's a good idea to take a look at some of the options for that. And the codex, the WordPress codex, talks about that. More security plugins can actually help you with some of these things. So some examples of those are iTheme Security, Security, and WordFence. The ones here that have dollar upgrade, so iTheme Security and WordFence both have basic free options, but they have more advanced pro options, paid options that you can choose to upgrade for. And these tools will sort of do most of what we've talked about here. A lot of them will walk you through the basics of configuring things like htaccess and wp-config and your user access and different settings just through a GUI interface, and then you can select what you need to for how you would like to configure that, and the plugin will take care of it for you. There are also scanning tools out there that you can set to either scan on a regular basis or just scan when you go in and you think there's a problem. And they can look through your installation of WordPress for anything that's unusual or shouldn't be there and help identify things that might be a problem. So these are great tools. At a minimum, you should really have some kind of basic security plugin, even if it's just a free one, to help you make sure that you're doing the baseline hardening of your WordPress site. There's other logging and tracking tools out there. Again, we talked a little bit about how your server should have logs, but there are other tools out there that will do that as well. CodeGuard is one that you do have to pay for. You can also define a log of the output that will output problems with your site if you need to do that. And then there's other things like, for example, Stream is a plugin that is freely available, and it will just take note of all changes to your site. So if one of your users, for example, who's an administrator, logs in and then deactivates a plugin, you'll be able to see in Stream that happened, when it happened, and who did it, just so that you have that kind of record. And then there's other tools out there that will do theme and plugin checks, and they just sort of evaluate on various parameters to see if your theme is written well, if it's secure, if there's vulnerabilities that they can identify. So you can install those, and from time to time, just do a quick check of what you have installed and make sure that that it's good and that it's up to date and running well. So one of the things, because WordPress is so easy to use, a lot of times people who use WordPress have a tendency to, without realizing it, just sort of not be as secure as they should be. They have, this is joking, of course, a sign saying "Welcome hackers" with a plate of biscuits. We don't really mean that, but also we do mean that, because sometimes they, without thinking about it, their security is not foremost in their mind, and they may accidentally leave things open. And we see this a lot in the fact that almost 10% of hacks come from users. So again, there's a few things that we can do to improve this. Campus has two-factor authentication in place, but it's possible, if you are not using Campus authentication, to have other plugins that will do it for you. Again, if you are an NC State website, we really strongly suggest that you use NC State authentication. Campus Engineering Department has built two plugins, NC State Multi-Auth, and then the more recent Mars plugin. And these can be installed and configured to authenticate to default so that all accounts are NC State accounts, or potentially you can have either NC State accounts or local accounts, and then you sort of make it easier for users to use their campus authentication, and then they don't have to remember another ID and password. And this is really the best thing we could suggest. There's other things that you can do. Most often, you would do this with the help of a security plugin that can help configure these things, where it will either limit the number of logins, or it can even be configured in some cases, depending on your plugin, to block someone after they have too many bad login attempts, or block an IP address. If you wanted, you can hide the URL to your login page for WordPress. So most of you probably know that if you go to a site that's a WordPress site, if you go to the home page and then do /wp-admin, that will automatically take you to the login page. And this is another sort of weakness with WordPress, that everybody and their brother knows that if you want to log into a site that's in WordPress, all you have to do is type /wp-admin, and then instantly you're able to get up to a login screen. So some of the tools out there will actually hide that login page and make it more difficult for a hacker to try to even get to that login page to even try to attack it. One of the configurations that you can do in WordPress is to turn off the display of usernames on the front end. So instead of showing the ID, it will just show like the full name or some other description of a user. And that's helpful because then, someone who's trying to hack the site will no longer have what's basically half the equation, right? So to log in, they have to have both the ID and the password successfully to get in. And it might sound silly or obvious, but and usually it's pretty easy to find the ID, but and we count on the password as being the more hardened or more difficult thing to bypass. But truly, not having the user ID is a big name, and if there's a way to not provide that information to make it that much harder for a hacker to try to attack your site, that's a good idea. And then whenever possible, trying to have stronger password encryption. WordPress defaults to a specific level of encryption. However, you can choose to up that. That's a database setting. And I wouldn't recommend messing with that if you're not familiar with how to do it, but it is something that could potentially help. Again, and we've said this several times, but giving users the minimum access that they need to get things done is very helpful. If you have users who, have admin access and don't have a strong password or forget it or are in bad habits, or if you think about it, even if they decide to respond to a phishing attack and somebody gets a hold of their account for something else, like their email, for example, that may lead them back to figuring out what their ID and password is, and then they can use it for other things. So there are a number of ways where people can figure out what an ID and password are, and it's a good idea to make sure that you limit the access to really only what they absolutely need. There are ways to configure your site so that, for example, you can only log in from on campus or from other restricted areas. And you can also try to encourage security on local machines. So making sure that you talk to your users about having antivirus software and making sure that their environments are secure. Those are good best practices. Now, let's say that you've done all this. You have fought the good fight. However, somehow your site has still managed to be hacked. What do you do? And again, I talked about this earlier. A lot of people don't realize that they've been hacked. So the initial phase will be for a hacker to get access and then to put that back door in there. And most of the time these days, that's it. That's all they do. They lie low for maybe a month, maybe 4 months, maybe 6 months before they do anything else. And the tricky thing there is that when you go to try to restore your site to before the quote unquote hack, you're just going back to before they did the damage. But in reality, they've been in there longer. So step one is to stay calm. And that can be very difficult. It's really stressful. And obviously there's an urgency to try to get things restored as quickly as possible. And there's not, you may have to come to terms with the fact that this is going to be a process. And yes, you want to get your stuff back as quickly as possible, but even after it's back, you're not done. There's going to be effort to figuring out what happened. So step two is to get your site back. We're going to talk about these a little bit more, and then clean up the hack and identify the source, and then go back and review all the points of vulnerability that we sort of already talked about. So step one, staying calm. And then step two is to get your site back. So how do you do that? First of all, you got to lock out the hackers. And the way to do that is to start by removing any unknown users and resetting all passwords. So one of the first things you want to do is check your database and make sure that the list of users in there is accurate, that they're not unknown, that there's a lot of times the username may not seem weird, but the email address associated with it might be a clue that it's not normal. So wherever you're unsure, going into the database and removing those users is critical. And then you want to make sure that you reset your passwords. I think we're going to talk about in a next slide about salts, but what that's going to do is set it so that everybody who's in there gets kicked out and everyone has to reset their password. Oh yeah, change your keys. So this is keys or salts are what you're talking about. These are your security keys, and they're set in WP config as well. What happens is when you change those out, anyone who is currently logged into your site will immediately be thrown out and will have to re-authenticate. So if you've done step 1 here and removed the unknown users and reset passwords, then step 2 is they can't get logged back in, right? So once you've changed it, they get thrown out and then they can't get back. It's also a really good idea at this point to take a backup of what you have. And this is for, I'm completely blanking on the term, forensics, right? So this may not be something that you dig into, but chances are your hosting environment is really going to want to take a close look at what happened, what got attacked, what the vulnerable point was, so that they can, address it for other sites, so they can figure out what usernames got created or what kind of uploads were there. And if nothing else, it's a good snapshot of where the site was when it was hacked so that you can try to restore it. But ideally, you want to take that backup and then put it aside, save it locally on your machine, and don't mess with it for now. And then at that point, you want to go ahead and try and restore your site to a known good version. And again, this assumes that you are doing your backups regularly. And again, you want to make sure that you can go back to a point where ideally there's no other hacks that have taken place, there's no backdoor, and it's going to take some work to make sure that's not the case. So when you're cleaning things up, you want to make sure that whatever you've gone back to is clean, that your files and database don't have any suspicious elements. If you are in really dire straits, you may have to start over with a fresh WordPress install and then reinstall your themes and plugins. It's daunting, no doubt. It will certainly take time, but this is the best way to be completely sure that all of the code that's in there is clean, because it's possible to add malicious code to existing files, which is unfortunate and difficult to track. Create new user accounts with new passwords, and then whatever content you can get, you want to import from the cleanest backup possible. And definitely talk to your hosting company. Again, if you have a good hosting company, they should be as concerned or more so about this than you are, and they should already be doing their own forensics to try to figure out where the hack came from and what else might have been affected. So either you or, again, your hosting company is probably going to want to go through your source that you copied over to see where this happened. It's possible to use version control, and if you're not familiar with that, I won't dig into that too much, but Git or SVN are version control that will allow you to compare one set of code to another so that you can see what may have changed. So if you have, a known copy that's good and clean, you can compare it to the hacked version and see where the problems are occurring. And again, your hosting company should have logs. They should be able to use various malware scanning tools to make sure that there's nothing else questionable in there. And you should also be scanning your own personal machine for virus and malware. If it is a user vulnerability, as in somebody's account got hacked and then they got in, that should be something that you can find out pretty easily. And obviously you want to throw that user out and change their password and give them less access. But if the hack came from a user, you need to understand whether that was somebody got a hold of their password or they have some kind of vulnerability on their machine. So you really want to try to figure out exactly where this came from. 30% of sites that have been hacked get hacked again. And again, a lot of this has to do with if your account was hacked and you try to go back to a clean version, but you don't go back far enough and there's some sort of backdoor still in there, or that you clean it up, but you don't go far enough with actually reviewing and auditing and then protecting your site going forward. Those are the problems. So you want to go back and address all the vulnerabilities, even after you've restored everything. And again, you've pulled the backup, you've gotten everything to a clean version. Guess what? Go back and change the passwords again. Go back and change the WordPress security keys and salts in the WP config again. Throw everybody out and make them log in again. It might be inconvenient, and depending on your environment, you may or may not be able to do this. But in general, this is a good best practice, is to really make sure that everything is clean. And then start over and re-review all of the things in your site for potential security weaknesses. Check those plugins again. Check those themes. Wherever possible, just use the bare minimum. and then scan your new site, get your hosting company to help you review your entire environment, and use your experience to plan for the next hack. However you were hacked this time, know that that's a weakness. And or maybe in the process of auditing, you realize that you had another weakness someplace else that you weren't even aware of. And so take an opportunity to look at that and make sure that that is addressed. Try to remind yourself that oh, okay, yeah, so this is the scenario where things are really bad. It's the end of the world when you get hacked and you don't have a backup. If you haven't been keeping backups, then you really are in trouble. So again, going back to our initial scenario, you want to save what you can, make a copy of it and save it locally. And then just go back. At this point, you're going to have to do a clean install of WordPress and then like literally copy and paste text wherever you can. And it may mean like copying it out of the database or off the front of the page. Maybe it's you're using the Wayback tool. There's the internet Wayback tool to try to view the pages and get the content wherever you can. You don't want to try to reuse any of your WordPress core files. You can use the content in your database because it should be text specific. And then if there are other things that have been injected in that text, you should be able to see it. But this is a case where there are some times when hackers are incredibly cruel and evil and will just drop random stuff into even the core of your content. And so it's incredibly difficult to copy stuff over, which is why you really want to make sure that you're hardening your site up front and not trying to get into a situation like this where you're literally trying to copy and paste each individual page to restore things. This is the end of the world. This is the nightmare scenario. So, as a reminder, it's dangerous out there. There are a lot of people, unfortunately, after WordPress sites, and you want to work to avoid, the most common mistakes. Make sure that you're updating your WordPress site, or alternately paying somebody to take care of that for you. That is an option. But one way or another, you want to make sure that your stuff is being up to date, that it's being reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that you don't have old stuff in there. Don't just use popular plugins because they're popular. Don't have 2 or 3 versions of a forms plugin or an image gallery plugin or, different. There's a lot of people out there who will have multiple types of plugins for one thing. There's no reason for that. You only need one social media plugin. You only need one gallery plugin, if even that many. Don't use admin accounts. Don't use any kind of really generically named account. Try to be creative with your account usernames. Please avoid weak passwords. If you're not using campus authentication, at least have some other tool in there that enforces some sort of minimum level of password creation so that you don't have, 5-character 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 passwords. And avoiding bad hosting or poor hosting companies. If you get hacked or if you start to have problems, if you even reach out to your hosting company to ask questions and they're not responsive, maybe consider moving to a new hosting company. And make sure you have backups. It's so critically important that you have that. It's so difficult to get back from a hack if you don't have that. So again, best practices, and at this point we're starting to sound repetitive, make sure all of your stuff is up to date. Make sure you have some kind of security plugin installed, and then once you install it, please go back and make sure it's configured. So review all the different sections and pages in there and make sure that it's appropriate for what you need to do in your site. Remember that as you configure things, sometimes you might wind up, inadvertently restricting something more than you should, and then it's a problem for, a user to upload something, or you have a problem, logging in, or it's possible that in the process of doing security configuration, you might have too much restriction on how your site works, and you have to dial that back. But, when in doubt, aim high and, pull back from there. Check on your user accounts, and again, make sure that users have the minimum access that they need to do what they need to do. Clean up your old themes and plugins and user accounts. If you're in a multi-site environment, clean out those old multi-site sites. And make sure that your hosting environment is cleaned out as well. So if you have, for example, I know a lot of people will install a new WordPress, a new copy of WordPress if they update their site, and they'll just migrate things over. And we're guilty of this too. Sometimes you leave that old WordPress site in the hosting space and you don't remove those files. guess what? Clean that stuff out. Doesn't need to be there. There are a lot of people out there. I mean, obviously, WordPress is popular and security is an important issue. So there's a lot of places that you can go to for ongoing alerts and updates. vulndb.com, Security, which you may have recognized as one of the plugins that we talked about earlier. They have a lot of security, WordPress-related security stuff. And when there are vulnerabilities, they will post about them. WP Campus is a WordPress group for higher education specifically, and they have posts about security. And then there's a couple others in here that you can look at. And these will, generally give you good advice, but then also if, for example, there's a vulnerability discovered in the latest version of WordPress or in a specific theme or plugin, those will get posted to these kinds of sites and lists, and then you can check and make sure you don't have them on your site and either get them updated or uninstalled. And just remember, you're not alone. WordPress, again, is on about 30% of websites out there. And you certainly, if you do get hacked, you're not the first person to have that happen to you. There's resources out there to help you get through it. If nothing else, you can, if you're on campus, always contact OIT and OIT Design, and we can try and see what we can do to help. But make sure that you're doing, the minimum stuff to either keep yourself secure or help you get back to normal if you do get hacked. So here's a list of resources. A lot of the links we already shared, and a big shout out to the group that does to the guy that does the Stormtrooper images, because we love him. So if you have any questions about these, now would be the time. I'm going to jump over to the Q&A section and see if, Brian's been answering questions. Thanks, Brian. Let's see. Talking a little bit about single sign-on with Jetpack. Yeah, so Jetpack is another tool, and there are plenty of tools out there for authentication. If you're on campus, yeah, ideally we want you to be using campus authentication, just because your users should already have a Unity ID and password. They won't have to remember a new one. Like I said, it automatically gets updated at least once a year. So that's built in, and we don't have to mess with it. But if you're off campus, or if you want to use something else, you can. There are tools that will help install authentication through Google or through WordPress.com or through any number of other types of resources. My only thing would be just make sure that you're only using one, because that's another thing where we've seen some people have multiple authentication tools installed, and that's a real nightmare, as you can probably imagine. Anybody else have questions for us? Well, that training calendar is a little bit out of date, which is a bummer, but there will be more classes available this summer for WordPress. If you want to check those out, that schedule should be released in the next about 2 weeks or so. Jonathan is asking about selectively preventing PHP execution. So I'll be full disclosure, although we're not endorsing anything, we use the pro version of iThemes Security. It's been hit or miss for us, honestly. We've had to go back and add some extra code on our own to stop it from conflicting with SHIB in some weird instances, because iThemes Security is not really built for higher ed and doesn't always think about some of those other issues when it's putting in its code. But one of the options in iThemes Security is to allow you to disable PHP execution in various parts of your WordPress install. So you can disable it in themes, in plugins, and in, Brian, do you remember where else? There's a few options. Oh yeah, the uploads folder, which definitely, that's a no-brainer. So we typically turn off PHP execution for uploads. I think we leave it for themes and plugins. And then anything else, that's most of the PHP install. So I think that covers that. Does that answer your question? Hopefully that answered your question. And I will say we are far from experts on this topic. One of the people that we quoted in this presentation, Paul Gilzo from University of Missouri. He works a lot with the higher ed WordPress group and WP Campus, and he's done some great presentations on how to address addresses and even like to look at your site from the perspective of a hacker and see where the vulnerabilities are. So he's a great resource if you want to reach out to somebody and see this more. By all means, if you have more experience with this, we would love to get feedback because we could always stand to update this presentation. So it's always good to get that kind of feedback. Thanks, Jonathan, for doing our documentation there. So I think we're just about at time. If anybody has any follow-up questions, you can always get a hold of us. Email OIT_WordPress at help.ncsu.edu, and that's going to come to our group, and we can try to address your questions. If you want to know more about what Campus is doing in terms of hosting for security, specifically with WordPress, you can always drop an email to OIT_web_services at help.ncsu.edu. We work a lot with Charles Braybeck, Josh Snap, and Harry Nicholas to make sure that our environments are really built, especially targeted to WordPress and trying to address security for those. And for the most part, we think we do a good job. So knock on wood. Now we're all going to get hacked. So I'm going to hang out here for a few more minutes if anybody has any questions. But otherwise, I think you should get a follow-up survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could let us know how we did, or if you have any extra feedback or suggestions, we'd happily take them. And thank you so much.